During World War I, Captain Godfrey L. Carden, commander of the Coast Guard's New York Division, was named captain of the port in that harbor. The majority of the nation's munition shipments abroad left through New York. For a period of 1.5 years, more than 1,600 vessels carrying more than 345 million tons of explosives sailed from this port. In 1918, Carden's command was the largest single command in the Coast Guard. It was made up of 1,400 officers and men, 4 Corps of Engineers tugs, and 5 harbor cutters. His pioneering work defined the Coast Guard's port security mission for the next 60 years. This was worn by Captain of the Port Security Specialists during World War II. On August 4, 1942, the District Coast Guard Officer, 13th Naval District, was directed by headquarters to enroll as a special group of temporary reservists, private plant guards in facilities where naval construction or construction of interest to the Navy was being carried out. The primary purpose of the establishment of the Coast Guard Police was to give the facilities involved a certain amount of military protection, large military immunity, and the law enforcement power of the Coast Guard.
A Coast Guard port security patrol in New York utilizing the ubiquitous Jeep.
A marine inspection officer boarding a ship from a boat manned by temporary reservists. One of the many harbor craft utilized by Coast Guard port security patrols. This was an example of a 30-foot Hanley fireboat, one of many built between 1942 to 1943, that had 4 500-gallon-a-minute fire pumps. Note the Coast Guard ensign flying from the makeshift staff. Loading explosives, the 25th of May 1944, Norfolk, Virginia. The club swinging member of the CGB 48th Shore Patrol is on duty outside the barge office. Teamwork. Coast Guard and New York City fireboats battling a Pier 4 Hoboken, New Jersey blaze together. Coast Guard firefighters working with municipal smoke eaters. A quartet of 1,000-pound aerial bombs that will help keep the Axis cauldron boiling is swung aboard ship under the experienced eyes of Coast Guardsmen. In the foreground is a Coast Guard fireboat, ready in case of trouble. Coast Guardsmen have inspected and guarded the bombs before loading and inspect them again when they are stowed away. Coast Guard merchant vessel inspection personnel kill rats on board a merchant vessel in New York Harbor. Keeping a weather eye out for trouble. Viewing Manhattan's skyscrapers from deck of CGB 48. Is that someone coming down to the dock at this time of night? A Coast Guard sentry and his German Shepherd dog watch with alert interest the approach of the automobile whose headlights reveal their presence. Waterfront installations, bridges, river locks and other key defense points are guarded by Coast Guardsmen. Keen senses of trained dogs add to the efficiency of Coast Guard patrol work. A Coast Guardsman checks ID of a truck driver upon entering a facility. Coast Guard port security personnel patrol the dockyards, ensuring the safety of the cargo prior to its being loaded for shipment to the United Kingdom. First step in dropping blockbusters on the enemy is getting them to Allied air bases for the bombardiers. Here a US Coast Guard shore patrolman watches the 2,000-pound death capsules being hoisted aboard ship. A large detail of Coast Guardsmen constantly patrol the docks as a precaution against sabotage. Loading and stowing aerial bombs in an Allied freighter was a laborious and dangerous task.
The duty officer reads the day's orders to the security teams before they set out on their rounds of piers and security areas. Captain of the port, left to right, Charles A. Hammond, BM1, Ivan E. Hilton, GM2, checking warehouse for proper stowage of cargo. A Coast Guard boarding party assists customs in a search for contraband goods on board a foreign vessel at the entrance to New York Harbor, collaborating with other government agencies concerned in the protection of shipping and waterfront facilities is one of the many duties of the Coast Guard captain of the port in enforcing port security regulations. Guard scrutinized cargoes carried by merchant ships into US ports throughout the Cold War period. The Coast Guard. A 65-foot harbor tug is shown here inspecting the piers at the port of Philadelphia. The crew is alert to report any fire hazards and is ready to man the tug's firefighting equipment in case of emergency. US Coast Guard 95-foot patrol craft, the Cape Gull, WPB 95304, is on port security patrol in New York Harbor.
Ignoring the possibility of major explosion, Coast Guard firefighters battle the fierce Spring Hill Inferno.
The chief mate, seated on a US merchant vessel, checks a manifest with a US Coast Guard chief petty officer from the captain of the port office in New York Harbor. On the 17th of February 1966, US MACV requested SINPAC to ask the Commandant Coast Guard for 2 explosives loading detachments, each consisting of 1 officer and 7 enlisted. The ELDs were to be highly trained in explosives handling, port security, and also be able to instruct others in these duties. The Commander-in-Chief Pacific forwarded the request to Joint Chief of Staff, and the Chief of Naval Operations requested that the Coast Guard provide them. The 2 ELDs were sent, with ELD number 1 located at Norby, and ELD number 2 at Cam Bay. The US Coast Guard experts supervised the loading of ammunition and other supplies in US ports, and their unloading in South Vietnamese ports during the entire conflict. Cam Bay, Coast Guard Explosive Loading Detachment Number 2. Engine Man First Class Robert J. Yared receives the Silver Star Medal from Rear Admiral William B. Ellis, Commander, 1st Coast Guard District, in ceremonies held at the Coast Guard station here. Engine Man Yared distinguished himself by exceptionally valorous actions on the morning of the 18th of February, 1968, as the safety advisor to the United States Army Terminal, Cat Lai, Vietnam. The terminal was attacked by intense enemy rocket fire, mortar fire, and small arms fire. One of the rocket rounds struck a barge on which there were several hundred tons of mortar ammunition, and immediately ignited a fire. The blazing barge threatened to destroy 3 other ammunition ships on which there were in excess of 15,000 tons of high explosives. Engine Man Yared, without regard for his personal safety, exposed himself to the enemy gunfire as he helped extinguish the fire on the burning barge. His courageous act averted destruction of the ammunition ship and the Army terminal. Engine Man First.